thank you for being here. My name is Huff Cooksey. I'm the executive director of the Bastion Institute. The Bastion Institute, we're about 18 months in. It was formed as an effort to speak about why American strength abroad is so important to Americans here at home, China, Iran, Afghanistan, why America's presence outside of the United States impacts each one of us in this room and beyond. We're honored today to have two of our board members in the back of the room, Kent Lucan and Colonel Dave Trotter, both Iowans. So thank you for being here. And also want to thank Secretary Paul Pate, who I'm sure many of you know. He is sponsoring us here at the Cedar Rapids Country Club. So thank you to him and to the staff here for all their help. But with that, without further ado, I'd like to introduce your Senator Joni Ernst to take it away.
Hey, it is, thanks, Huff, and it is really great to have you here today. And I want to thank everyone that is joining us virtually as well for a wonderful discussion today. We've got some special guests. So first, I'd like to introduce Congressman Mike Gallagher. Mike, why don't you come on out? Mike represents, yes, warm welcome. Thank you. So, Congressman Gallagher represents Wisconsin's 8th District in the U.S. House of Representatives, where he is the chairman of the House Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party. He is also the chairman of the Cyber Information Technologies and Innovation Subcommittee on the House Armed Services Committee, and he's a member of the House Intelligence Committee as well. Prior to taking office, Mike served for 7 years in the United States Marine Corps active duty. And he also had 2 deployments to Iraq. So Mike, thank you for being here today. We're going to have you right here in the middle. And then our next special guest is no stranger to this area. We also have with us today Congresswoman Ashley Hinson. So Ashley, thanks so much, Ashley. She is an Iowa native, and she is an award-winning journalist and a proud wife and mother of 2 incredible young men. I happen to like them very much. She was elected to the United States House of Representatives in 2020. Ashley previously served in the Iowa State House and represented Iowa's 67th House District, serving Hiawatha, Robbins, Cedar Rapids, and Marion, where she currently resides. So thank you, Ashley, for joining us today as well. So we are going to go ahead and get started. Yes, please give them another welcome. So we're just going to have a very informal conversation. I know a number of you have attended Bastion Institute panels before, and we are really grateful for your interest, especially when it comes to foreign policy and making sure that America remains strong. So we're going to kick off. Just both of you can answer, but I'll start with you, Mike, because you are the chair. You are both currently serving on the Select Committee on China. And so, Mike, you're the chair. Why don't you go ahead and walk us through the purpose of this Select Committee and what the goals and objectives would be?
Well, first of all, let me say what an honor and privilege it is to be here in Iowa. Not my first time in Iowa. I came here in 2016. I was working for Governor Walker at the time, who was running for president. Great governor of the state of Wisconsin. I'm also highly cognizant of the fact that you have a lot of Packers fans in Iowa, and we welcome those. We'll take as many of them as we can get, although it'll be an interesting year for the Green Bay Packers. Who knows what's going to happen? What an incredible senator you have. Really a top thought leader on national security issues and defense issues, and someone I continually look for advice and mentorship. So Senator Ernst, thank you not only for having us here today, but just for the role you play in the United States Congress. It's incredibly unique, and you should all be very proud of your senator and Senator Ernst. Among the many things I love about the great Ashley Hinson is the fact that she's such a talented musician, and her ability to play the violin in particular. She has been, I think she is our best communicator on the Select Committee on China, and her ability to connect these big geopolitical issues to the everyday lives of an Iowa farmer or a Wisconsin farmer is really unparalleled. And the position she sits on practically in Congress on both the Appropriations Committee and the Select Committee is a really unique one. And so Ashley has done phenomenal work. I would describe the mandate we have from the Speaker as really twofold. One, we have to explain to our colleagues and by extension, the American people, why any of this matters, why someone should care about the threat posed by the Chinese Communist Party, and why this isn't just a distant over there threat. It isn't a matter of some obscure territorial claim in the South and East China Sea. It's a right here at home threat. And you don't need a Chinese spy balloon to remind you of the threat to American sovereignty. There have been high-profile cases of economic espionage conducted against Iowa farm interests, the theft of ag intellectual property. Given that China is food insecure, they're doing their best to steal our best agricultural technology right here in the heart of the Midwest. So explaining the nature of the threat is step one. Step two is then using that understanding of the threat to galvanize action in Congress. It won't surprise you to learn that in Congress, it's often difficult to get things done. Right now, Congress is divided. The evil Senate is controlled by Democrats. The House is narrowly controlled by Republicans. But we don't want to waste the 2 years that we have. And in the House, I sort of view it as 2 years is all you have, right? You get elected for 2 years, you have to do the people's business. And so the Speaker wants us on the Select Committee to coordinate among the various committees in order to develop a plan of action for how we beat China in this new Cold War. And I use that phrase very deliberately. I'm not suggesting that this is perfectly analogous to the threat posed by the Soviet Union in the old Cold War, but in my opinion, the threat is even more complex because it's not just a military threat, it's also an economic and an ideological threat. And I think this is an existential threat. I think looking back in 20 years, long after we've all left Congress, the one question that will haunt all of us is what did we do in this moment to defend America from increasing communist aggression? And that is the question we need to answer on the Select Committee on China.
Thank you. Thanks, Mike. And Ashley, let's just keep with that theme and what we're working on, or what you are working on through the Select Committee, and more on how it applies directly to Iowa, too. Congressman Gallagher had mentioned the theft of farm or agricultural intellectual property. Maybe you can talk a little bit more about that. We are a huge exporter to China when it comes to soybeans and corn. So let's just hear a little bit more about that from you, please.
Yes. Well, thank you, Senator. And I agree with everything Mike just said. And this is a huge threat. And I think we've kind of been asleep at the wheel for decades in how we've handled China. We've allowed them into the World Trade Organization. They continue to steal our intellectual property. They continue to steal our people. They continue to everything, right? And down to our seeds. And one of the stories that we love to tell and associated with this committee, and we're actually having a kind of a field roundtable later today to talk about this and highlight these issues. But it was a little over a decade ago that a Chinese spy ring was actually busted right here in Iowa by the FBI. They were trying to take our seeds back to China to genetically re-engineer them, reverse engineer them, copy them, steal that, all that research and development, right? So that's just one blaring example of what the Chinese are doing right here in our backyard. And this has been going on for decades, and we have been asleep at the wheel. Senator Ernst is right. We export billions of dollars of goods to China. Iowa is a huge ag exporter to China, but China is not playing by the rules. And I think it's high time, and a lot of the work on our committee is to take a look at not just how their malign activities are hurting Uyghur Muslims, the humanity atrocities that they keep perpetrating around the world, but also to figure out how we can be economically competitive. And some of that means shining a light on the fact that they're not playing fair. So I think we've been having conversations with many of our witnesses about how we can hold them accountable, either making sure that companies that are investing in China are wide-eyed about what those investments are doing, where those dollars are flowing to, as well as making sure that whatever trade agreements we have going forward, we enter into with the understanding that they are not playing fair, have not played fair, and have not fulfilled their end of the deal. So the way I see it, if they're not fulfilling their end of the deal, that's taking those resources right from Iowa farmers and from the people who do feed and fuel the world. So we need to be doing everything we can to not only counter their malign activities and their economic espionage, but also continue to develop trade relationships around the world with people who actually share our values.
Yeah, thank you, Ashley. It is extremely complex, and I think this is an issue that our farmers and our ag businesses, no matter what state we reside in, we will have to juggle these and figure out the priorities and the path forward when it comes to China. So thank you for being so diligent on that. I know that Iowa and China have a very unique relationship, and it's one that we will have to navigate through. So recently, we really have paid attention to the threat that China poses in the South China Sea, and they've been conducting very aggressive military movements through the Indo-Pacific region. And this is something on the Armed Services Committee that we talk about. It takes a significant amount of our time. And just recently, then Congressman Gallagher and I proposed a piece of legislation. It has been included in the National Defense Authorization Act for this year, but it's legislation to create rings of fire is what we're calling it, not the Johnny Cash song, but rings of fire. And what it is, it's actually missile defense and a missile defense system to counter China and their aggressive nature. So Mike, maybe talk about this legislation and why it will be important for this region. And then Ashley, we'll follow on with you and talk about other areas outside of maybe military where we need to maybe be concerned about China and how members of Congress can react.
Well, if memory serves, it did all start with you and I listening to Johnny Cash once.
Oh, yes.
And we were like, we need to build a piece of legislation
did.
around now. I think an interesting starting point is actually this question of why did deterrence fail in Ukraine, right? Because we're dealing with this massive, devastating conflict in Eastern Europe right now that is not only destructive for the people of Ukraine, it has the potential to destabilize all of NATO right now. And we're having this debate about whether to support the Ukrainians, how much to support the Ukrainians, how to assure accountability with American aid. But I think we would all agree it would have been better if the war did not occur in the first place, if deterrence had held, so that we weren't dealing with this. It certainly would be better for the Ukrainian people. In my opinion, deterrence failed in Ukraine. We failed to deter Vladimir Putin because we relied solely on the threat of sanctions and sternly worded statements coming out of the Biden administration State Department, as opposed to hard power. We pulled all of our hard power preemptively out of Ukraine. We sent our ships sailing out of the Black Sea. And in so doing, we sent a stronger signal than anything the State Department said in a mean tweet to Vladimir Putin. And the signal was, minor incursion, not a big deal. And thus, Vladimir Putin ignored all of our warnings, ignored all the threats, and invaded Ukraine for the second time, right? Because he did not fear us. He did not fear American hard power. So the lesson, if we want to prevent a war from breaking out in the Pacific, a war that would have the potential to make the war in Ukraine look like child's play in comparison. If the United States found itself in a war with communist China, it would be incredibly, incredibly destructive to the world. Our goal should be to deter that war from happening. But we need to apply the lessons of Ukraine to the Taiwan Strait and not repeat those lessons. And the lesson is to put hard power in Xi Jinping's path before it's too late, so that every day he wakes up, he looks across the Taiwan Strait and he concludes that today is not the day. And we're not doing that. So what Senator Ernst and I are proposing to do is to force the Pentagon to stockpile key munitions west of the international date line, key long-range precision fires that can sink Chinese ships and hold them at risk for very low cost before it's too late, before he launches the invasion. And that, we believe, is our best chance of preserving the peace. And incidentally, that's exactly what the Chinese have done to us. If you look at the last 20 years, what they've done is not just build the biggest Navy in the world, which they have. Our Navy's better in terms of capability, but they have more ships. They've built what you could refer to as an anti-Navy. They've built the rocket force, which can target our ships, keep them out of the fight for very low cost. So now that we are no longer bound by certain treaties that prevent us from deploying key rockets and munitions and missile systems, we need to take advantage of that in order to surge hard power to the Indo-Pacific before it's too late, which ultimately leads you, and I'm sorry to go on here, to kind of the paradox of deterrence, which is that to prevent war, you need to convince the other guy that you are willing to go to war. And that requires some, what we would call in the military, intestinal fortitude, right? It requires strength in the executive branch. It requires a strong commander-in-chief. So my only ask for you Iowans, did I get that right? Iowans, am I saying that? Okay. Whew.
Iowans,
That would have been.
You would have made news for the
Regions.
wrong reasons,
Yeah.
Mike.
I was gonna say almost Wisconsinites, like, because you're close. You have this enormous power. Everybody wants to be who wants to be president comes to Iowa. Ask them about this issue. Ask them about their plan to confront China and their plan specifically to deter a war with China over Taiwan. Because I regrettably say that as someone who studies this a lot, I see the risks of war increasing over the near term. And so we need to do everything in our power to deter that from happening, to prevent it. You need to wage peace as aggressively as you would, and creatively as you would wage war.
So what you're saying, Mike, it sounds a little Ronald Reagan-esque, doesn't it?
I think, of course, I mean, let's clap for Ronald Reagan. Yeah. I think that the basic formula of peace through strength endures. It was as true in the 1980s as it is today. Reagan did something else that I think we need to incorporate into our strategy, which is if you examine both the early and later stages of the Reagan administration, they not only embarked on a massive military buildup that promoted a peace dividend that we're still living off of right now. A lot of the systems we rely on were actually products of the Reagan buildup, and now they're really old and they're falling apart, and we have a readiness crisis. He also incorporated ideological warfare into our grand strategy. If you examine Reagan's speeches when he went to the Soviet Union, particularly his speech at Moscow State, they're absolutely brilliant. And he speaks directly to the Russian people, and he draws this wedge between the evil regime, which he did not hesitate to call evil, right? And we're walking on eggshells. We don't want to offend the Chinese Communist Party. Are they a competitor? Can we cooperate with them? Are they an enemy? Reagan didn't have any such hesitancy to call out evil when he saw it. But he spoke to the Russian people directly too. And similarly today, I think we need to revive the lost art of ideological warfare and draw that wedge between the Chinese Communist Party, which is evil, it is a genocidal totalitarian entity, and the Chinese people, with whom we have no quarrel, and who are the primary victims of the Chinese Communist Party.
Great. Thanks, Ashley. Yes.
Yeah,
Other
just-
areas.
Just to build on that a little bit, and I agree with everything Mike said, and we've been very intentional on our committee too, and I want to be clear about this, that our policy is designed to counter the CCP, not the Chinese people, and we've been very, very clear in a bipartisan way about our rhetoric surrounding that, because I do think that's important, but the Chinese Communist Party is oppressing its own people every single day. We see that. That's the stuff that keeps me up at night, the human rights abuses that are happening, for instance, to the Uyghur Muslims. So it is about the storytelling for us. But when you talk about deterrence, it goes further than that. And our committee has been talking a lot about the strategy that China has been exerting all over the world to gain, I guess you'd call it influence. They've been buying up strategic areas with infrastructure, putting out those resources in areas that, let's say, have a lot of critical minerals that we are going to increasingly become reliant on in the future. So they have been very, very strategic, and we have to play that same game. So when I said trade is really important, it is. We need to be making sure that we are seeking out new opportunities for our farmers and our manufacturers here in the United States with those those people who share our values. But we also need to be approaching these countries that have the resources that we're also going to need, and we need to be there as well. So that's something that I think when we talk about having a leader in the White House who can execute on that agenda, that is absolutely critical going forward. And we had witnesses from the Biden administration in our committee a few weeks ago, and I called them out on it. They've been weak with diplomatic speak. And so we need to speak loudly and carry a big stick, and that is how we will deter China from going to war with us.
Yeah, and thank you. And that's why we all know and love Ashley, is because she is such a great communicator. And all of those different aspects coming out of this select committee, really important, because while we don't talk about the human rights violations every single day, when we think about China, that is an important aspect there. The trade is an important aspect here in Iowa. Critical minerals are important to everyone, no matter what state you reside in. Think about your cell phones. We can't have those cell phones without the critical minerals and the rare earth elements and the chips that are probably manufactured in Taiwan. So really important stuff. So we just have wrapped up in the Senate the National Defense Authorization Act, and that has passed through the Senate. It has also passed through the House as well. And so we have some difference between the two bills, between the Senate and the House. But why don't we start with you, Ashley, maybe explaining why it is so important that we actually get the National Defense Authorization Act done. What does it really mean for our constituents?
Well, I think it's great that we were able to get versions of this passed, because it shows that we're moving forward and making sure we're taking care of our fighting force. The United States military is the elite fighting force. So I'd like to thank the two people sitting next to me on the chair who stood up to serve our country and fought for us, because I think that we all understand in this room that freedom is not free, and we need to do our part in the United States Senate and in Congress to make sure we're helping support that. The policies that we have in the NDAA are designed to ensure that our fighting force can stand up to all of our enemies and our adversaries around the world. Our House version eliminates a lot of the wokeness in the military. In my mind, we should be focusing on readiness with our military and making sure they have the equipment necessary. Mike talked a little bit about the Chinese having more boats than we do. We shouldn't be taking things out of commission if we can still use them. We need to, again, make sure our fleet is ready to, again, build that up and continue to deter. The other aspect that I think is important, and especially when it comes to Taiwan, Senator Ernst mentioned that many of the chips we all rely on are made there. It'll take a long time to rehome many of those things here to the United States, so it is critically important that we protect Taiwan and our interests there. So there are provisions in the NDAA that are specifically designed to make sure that our military is working with their military on readiness issues, that we are also fulfilling our end of the deal in getting weapons and munitions to them that they've ordered from us that we haven't provided. We need to make sure that we're doing that in a timely fashion. So, we want to talk about deterring war with us as well. Taiwan needs to be able to do that and deter as well. So those are a couple of the elements of the NDAA that I just see as incredibly important to making sure that we can still be that strong fighting force in the world.
Yeah, thank you. And Mike, you have worn the boots, and so you bring a very unique perspective to the Armed Services Committee. And if you could talk about a few of your initiatives as well, and again, why it's so important for your folks back home in Wisconsin, the folks that we have here in Iowa, and really the United States as a whole.
Well, first of all, you're being very nice to me today. Usually she's making Marine Corps jokes at my expense. So
I do.
I appreciate
I'm
that.
so sorry.
I appreciate that. But I got a lot of Army jokes, too, that I'm prepared. It's mutually assured destruction. You fire your missiles, I fire mine. Well, I second everything that Ashley said. Maybe I'll add a practical point. There's a lot of dysfunctional processes in Congress, but the NDAA is one of the last things that actually works pretty well. The process, it's a year-long process. It starts from the bottom up with member requests and initiatives, robust subcommittee hearings, robust oversight of the executive branch, and all day, all night, full committee hearing. I mean, it's kind of how Congress used to work. And so if we allow that process to erode, or if we allow ourselves to self-implode, I fear what that means for the functionality of the modern Congress. It's of course not a perfect bill. I mean, there's no such thing as a perfect bill in Congress, but if you want to deter war in the near term, and if you want to win the new Cold War over the long term, this is a good bill. This is a bill that is very focused on the China threat for all the reasons we talked about before. I would add, it expands dramatically our cooperation with key allies in the region, foremost among them, though not a formal ally, a partner, Taiwan. We have a provision that would turbocharge our cooperation in cyberspace with Taiwan, which is critical because I would submit to you that the invasion of Taiwan has already begun in cyberspace. As you start to look at other allies in the region, and we're in the market for allies that are willing to fight for themselves and invest in their own defense. Look what's happening in Japan right now. I mean, Japan is massively investing in their own defense. And think about the history of Japan, what a sea change this is culturally for them to do this. I mean, they're going to go from, I think, the 9th largest military by spending in the world to the 3rd, behind us in China. This is exactly what we want our allies to be doing. And if we don't make our own investments, we're sending a bad signal to our allies. And just to finally double down on something Ashley mentioned, we have legitimate concerns about the increasing politicization of the military, the politicization in particular of the DoD's civilian employee class, as well as the general and flag officer class. I got out as a captain, so I can criticize all these generals. You know, everything above the rank of captain, I'm very, very skeptical of. Apologies, Colonel, back there. Apologies. We are taking steps to dismantle the DEI bureaucracy in the military, which is not only incredibly divisive and I think adversely impacts our ability to recruit, and we're in the midst of a historic recruiting crisis that threatens the very survival of the all-volunteer force. It's based on garbage social science. There's no evidence that these programs actually achieve what they're trying to achieve. In fact, the best evidence we have suggests they increase intergroup hostility. And the military, more than any other organization, by design and necessity, needs to be a colorblind, meritocratic organization. I've been doing this deep dive into the Korean War because last week we celebrated the 70th anniversary of the Armistice Agreement. And this was the first war in which a lot of units were integrated, at least in the Marine Corps. And there was some tension at the time, but there's this great book written by a Marine rifle platoon commander at the time, Joseph Owen, called Colder Than Hell. It's about the Battle of Chosin Reservoir. And he talks about this issue, and he has this beautiful phrase where he says, you know, some members from the South didn't like racial integration, but by and large, since the politicians had hollowed out the military, the feeling was we needed all the good men we could get. And whether you were black or white, a Marine was a Marine. That's the ethos. That is the colorblind ethos that we need to restore in our military. And this NDAA makes an advance in that direction.
Yeah, thank you. And that's very powerfully said. I know, I think for anyone in the room who has served under the flag of our nation, you will understand that a Marine is a Marine, a soldier is a soldier. And I know the time that I spent in service, it really didn't matter who you served with, what their religious background was. It didn't, all of that didn't matter, the color of your skin. What mattered is that we were Americans, and we don't see the same emphasis on who we are as a collective whole. Instead, what we have seen is a push in the military to focus on individuals and uniqueness and how we make accommodation for individuals, not how we work together as a collective group for the good of our country. And so we really have to get back to that. And I'm hoping that the final version of the Defense Authorization Act between the Senate and the House brings everyone closer together rather than separates and divides us.
And I assume we're doing this at a golf course today to make even our Air Force brethren feel comfortable.
Yes,
right?
okay, I was waiting.
I'm just kidding.
I was waiting. We
Just
know
kidding.
the Air Force is the white collar workforce of our military.
Because we love.
Now joined by Space Force.
Yeah.
Which that's a whole nother topic.
Hey,
for
satellites
another
are
day.
important. Let's
right.
talk. So to hit on that, I mean, you mentioned that we need to be talking about cybersecurity and intelligence there. We've had many meetings and briefings from people way above my pay grade who are talking about that next frontier where we're going to be fighting. Think about your iPhone. I know I'm a millennial and our generation uses iPhones for maps, for everything. I'm just envisioning the day when we won't be able to use that to get from A to B because the Chinese have taken out that technology outside of this world, literally. So that is when you think about the real world impact and the mess that the Chinese could create for Americans every single day. It's not just the physical fighting that we might be thinking about with our military and munitions and energetics that are going to be going back and forth. No, it's about the fight that's also going to be happening in space. And so we need to be considerate of that as well.
Absolutely. Okay, so we have talked a couple times, and I alluded to your service. Mike, you spent 7 years active duty with the Marine Corps, and I know you probably weren't able to get into the Army. I'm sorry for that. Very sorry for that.
Do I need to sit in between you two? What's going on here?
Do you know what Army stands for, right, Senator?
Oh no, here we go.
Ain't ready to be a Marine yet.
This is how we go. This is how it goes all the time. But no, I appreciate Mike so much because we have engaged in a lot of work for our armed forces. He is a combat veteran. He has done 2 tours overseas. And so, Mike, I'd like you to share a little bit about your time in the Marine Corps, if you would do that briefly. But then also how it impacts your decision-making when you are working in Congress, and especially when it comes to our footprint within the military and how it's reflected on the world stage.
Well, thank you for that. I did 2 back-to-back deployments in 2007 and 2008. I didn't come from a military family. My family, mostly physicians, OBGYNs in Northeast Wisconsin, who also own pizza restaurants. So the family motto is whether it's babies or pizza, Gallagher's always deliver. So for me, it was an entirely new experience. I was drawn to it by the challenge, and particularly in the all-volunteer force, it is not supposed to be easy, right? We can't lower our standards. We need to have a high standard. It's a crucible. It's designed to be a crucible. I wanted a way to apply sort of the language and regional skill. I was studying Arabic in college, and I was thinking about the region, and then I wanted to serve my country because I felt like I'd been given a gift of being born an American citizen, and felt like I had a duty to serve my country, and felt very strongly, this is my sort of Catholic worldview, that one can serve God by serving one's country. But I get there in 2007, and it's still pretty chaotic in Iraq. My second day there, we had this group of Al-Qaeda in Iraq terrorists dressed in stolen Iraqi army uniforms cross the border from Syria and slaughter about 50 people in the local village. And so that created a ton of chaos. But by the time I went back in 2008 on my second deployment, we were walking around without our helmets, without our personal protective gear. It was a totally changed environment. And I share that to suggest I got to see that the surge worked. It was a profound expression of what America can do when we're strong, when we have clear goals. And whether you supported the invasion or not, the fact is that operation was incredibly successful. And there were a lot of people in Iraq that risked their lives to fight and die with us just so they could have a fraction of the freedom that we enjoy every day and take for granted here in America. And so for me, it was this lesson of what America can do when we get our act together, the enduring power of American ideals, and how I apply that today. I guess one thing that stands out, beyond sort of the general, I think the military, better than any organization, teaches you how to work with other human beings from different backgrounds to get a tough job done. Whenever I do something, particularly on the Armed Services Committee, I try to apply what I call the Lance Corporal test, which is, it's not a reflection on the creative ways in which Lance Corporals can steal things and get things done and get in trouble. You know, for every decision made in Washington, D.C., in the executive branch, in the halls of Congress, some 19, 20-year-old kid from Iowa or Wisconsin is going to have to deal with the implications of that decision. And things that look neat and tidy on a piece of paper in Washington, D.C., can get pretty darn messy, if not bloody, when you get to the pointy end of the spear. And so I think if we're going to send young men and women into combat in particular, we owe them our best. We owe them the best training, the best equipment, and we need to make sure we never send them into a fair fight. And so that I think is how my military experience has affected my time in Congress.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And thanks for being such a great warrior in your service to our nation, but then also in the halls of Congress. And I think it's incredibly important just to stress to all of you too that those that have served, especially those that have served combat tours overseas, regardless of what region they served in, they are bringing a wealth of knowledge and experience. And I love the fact that we have combatant commanders, general officers that will come in front of our committees and give us these very broad plans, but it's actually those veterans that are serving on some of these committees, those that have worn boots, they've been traversing up and down the roads in their Humvees or other vehicles, maybe they were a mechanic, maybe they were a supply sergeant, but they all really get what it means to that soldier, that Marine on the ground. What are the implications of the decisions that we're making in Washington, D.C., and how does that apply to that 18 or 19-year-old that has gone forward on our behalf? So pretty heavy stuff, I think, at the end of the day. And Ashley, you've been working on some other areas where it is pretty heavy stuff. And you have also embarked on many journeys to our southern border, where we have really a national security crisis. We have a humanitarian crisis. And if you would talk about your trips to our southern border, the implication of having an open and porous border, and then some of the ways that in the halls of Congress, you are working to make this situation better.
Well, thank you, Senator. And boy, Mike, I think they should send you to the U.S. Marine Corps office out here in Cedar Rapids. You can start recruiting here in Iowa. That was a pretty powerful
recruiting
story.
duty is too hard. Like
Yeah,
we send like our best officers to do recruiting duty. That was not me.
Yeah, well, I'm impressed, and I have to tell you this, that I think about all of these things as a mom too. My oldest is 12; he'll be 13 next year, and so when we think about the 2027 deadline, dealing with China, all these challenges facing our country for national security, I think about my boys because they're going to be that next generation who could end up in the military. And so I think about a lot of these decisions, and I'm thankful that I have my colleagues who can add that context of the military focus because they have served. We've got some Navy SEALs on the Appropriations Committee who speak very passionately about the work that they've done, and truly they have put their lives on the line to go after these bad guys too, and it puts it in perspective for me. But that's the filter I put on a lot of these decisions, including what's happening at the southern border, because you think about the children that are being abused by the cartels at our southern border. It's criminal what's happening to them. The gangs and the cartels are winning that war at our southern border. And last check, I think it was 1.6 million illegal immigrants had come into our country since President Biden took office. When you look at that number, that's more than a third of the population of the state of Iowa. It's completely unsustainable from a people standpoint, but the other crime here is the drugs and the weapons and all of the other illicit things that are flowing across our southern border. Fentanyl, you all hear a lot about that. It is killing Iowans and Americans. I had a constituent tell me they were afraid that the next pill his 15-year-old son with drug problems took would be the one that would kill him. So this is a very real fear in our own backyard, and we say it all the time, every state is a border state, every community is a border community because we have a wide open southern border. Now, China comes into this as well, because China is directly responsible for sending over and manufacturing a lot of the precursors for that dangerous fentanyl that is making its way into our communities. So obviously we did some work a few years ago to make sure China was scheduling fentanyl as a protected substance, but they got around that by just shipping the materials to Mexico, where the cartels are now making everything and then shipping it into the United States via the southern border. So I think this is a three-part solution. We have to stop China as best we can. We've passed some legislation to try to make it harder, sanction-wise, for them to get these products into Mexico and into our country. We need to provide resources at our southern border. We're trying to do that through our Homeland Security Appropriations Committee. We have a strong bill that helps support our CBP and ICE agencies so they can actually do their jobs to deter at our southern border. And then finally, we have to stand up to the cartels. Nothing's gonna change if they continue to be able to exercise their operations. They have military scale operations at our southern border. And so this is again a case where we have to match force with force, and until we do that, and until we secure our southern border, everybody's safety and security in this country is at risk.
Yes, and the fentanyl issue as well, Ashley, I am very, very concerned about, and the amount that is coming over the border. I was able to go to California. We don't often talk about the California border to Mexico, but the busiest land port of entry is actually in San Diego. This is the largest port of entry over land in the world. So at that port of entry, every single day, there are 22,000 pedestrians that enter through that port of entry, as well as 17,000 cars. And this is known to be where the greatest amount of fentanyl is entering into the United States. And unfortunately, we don't have the level of technology deployed to that area to be able to intercept the fentanyl that is coming through vehicles through that port of entry. If we would just bolster, those that are Customs and Border Protection and Border Patrol agencies, we certainly could intercept a lot more of that at this port of entry. But unfortunately, we haven't seen the intestinal fortitude from this administration to actually give them the resources they need to protect our families from fentanyl. Moving on to, and just keeping with our theme today of China and some of the nefarious activities that we have seen from China, and one that, while maybe not necessarily intentional, one that did impact not just the United States, but the world over, was COVID-19. And it does seem a little bit like a distant memory as we're looking in our rearview mirror. But the implications of the Wuhan Institute of Virology and the experimentation that they were doing at that institute, not just with Chinese dollars, but also with American taxpayer dollars, something that we have been able to ferret out, really caused a lot of heartache and hardship around the globe. The three of us have worked on various aspects of COVID-19. And so, Ashley, we'll start with you and talk about the implications of COVID-19 and why it's important that we continue looking for answers to COVID-19, how that applies here in the Midwest, and maybe things that we can do about it.
Well, I would just start by going back to the story I told when we first started talking today about the seeds being stolen, right? It's because they want to take those and look at the genetics, look at the R&D that's gone into those. It can be used against us as well, and that's exactly what I think all of us worry about, is what is China's main goal in doing this research? Look what it did to our economy, and look what it did to the world. Let's put it this way, the CCP does not give a rip about what they do to their own people. And so that became very clear by the lockdown policies and the damage they were willing to do to their economy. And I think that's where the hair on all of our arms should just go up, because when you look at what they're stealing and why, and where they're trying to set up these research institutions and then use our own dollars against us, that is a huge concern. So I would look at it from the dollars standpoint. We need to make sure that we are stopping the flow of American capital to places that the CCP can then just use for their military to advance AI that they're going to then use against not only our people, but against our military. So I would say that's a priority that I know our committee has been taking a look at in figuring out what that policy looks like. There is a lot to learn because these areas are moving so quickly. So we're doing our part to educate ourselves first, educate the American people and tell those stories, but then get real world feedback from you. That's why these events are so important, that we can have those conversations so we get this right going forward. But we cannot allow them to get away with it. So accountability is very important to match the policy that we put forward.
Well, I mean, let's say what's obvious, or what seems clear, which is that the pandemic emerged from the Wuhan Institute of Virology in China. And remember, if you said that a few years ago, you were called a racist. You couldn't say that, right? It was a massive, and even if you say, well, maybe it wasn't intentional, or maybe there was a natural origin, there is no dispute about the fact that the Chinese Communist Party did everything to cover and continues to do everything humanly possible to cover up the origin of the pandemic. And what was also revealed is the way in which they've corrupted all of these international organizations we have to prevent pandemics, like the World Health Organization. And this is an important issue. There needs to be a reckoning, both for the way in which they covered it up and our terrible response to the initial pandemic and all the things we got wrong, for at least two reasons. One, it gets to this question of whether the CCP can be trusted to abide by any promises they make on the world stage. And I would submit we should be very skeptical as to whether they can be trusted. And right now, the Biden administration is reviving diplomatic and economic engagement with China as a core pillar of our grand strategy. And the case people make for cooperating with China is that, well, our interests align when it comes to climate change and pandemic prevention. Well, how did that go? All right. And I can guarantee you that Xi Jinping does not care about the environment or commitments made on climate change at COP27. This is dramatically inhibiting our ability to get tough with China and compete effectively. The second thing is, and I want to try and relate this to the previous conversation about fentanyl. One thing we also saw during the pandemic was not only were they denying that this had anything to do with the Wuhan Institute of Virology, they were blaming us for the origin of the pandemic. I got into this big spat with one of these so-called wolf warrior diplomats on Twitter who said, well, Congressman Gallagher should just take a 4-hour drive to from Wisconsin to Fort Detrick, Maryland, and look at all the bad stuff that's happening there. That's where the virus started. And I said, well, look at a map. It's more like a 20-hour drive. Okay? Maryland and Wisconsin are far away. And I don't have a private jet. Unlike all the senators, I don't have a private jet. Just kidding. Yeah.
Oh, yes,
exactly.
thank you.
Yeah, exactly. I meant to qualify that. But it's just the propaganda machine was in overdrive. And so at the same time, we think about the fentanyl crossing our borders, our southern border, and killing tens of thousands of Americans. We have to think about the digital fentanyl that's crossing our borders via the internet, via American social media companies every day, and poisoning the minds of young Americans. And TikTok is highly addictive. It is digital fentanyl, both because of the addictive nature and ultimately it can be traced back to China. So the pandemic should have revealed to us who we're dealing with in the Chinese Communist Party and the fact that we are not prepared to deal with that threat. We need to get our act together in order to prevent both a pandemic or something worse like a Chinese bio attack from happening in the future.
Yes, exactly. And to the point where you will state that the Chinese don't care about their own people, I happened to be on a flight and it was coach. I don't have one of those private jets. But it was shortly after the pandemic, flights were resuming, and I was sitting next to a gentleman who he didn't know who I was. We were all masked up, and he was talking about a trip that he had made to China a decade or more back. and how there was a strange illness that had popped up in a little village that he was visiting. And he saw these lesions on people's arms, and he wasn't sure what was happening. And he had done some time with the CDC and other organizations, and he thought it looked like AIDS, HIV and AIDS. And so he was telling me the story, and he brought it to the village elders, and they said, "Oh no, we don't have that here. That doesn't happen here. No, no, no." And come to find out, in that village, they had a communal bathroom and shower facility, and they all used the same toothbrush in this little village, very rural area. And so he took this back to the village elders, and he said, "No, I do think you have a serious problem. One way we can alleviate this spread," because you think if they're all using the same toothbrush and bleeding gums, and they just continued to share that from member to member through the village, he said one way to alleviate spreading this is by providing toothbrushes for every member of your village. And the village elder said, no, that costs too much. So spending a nickel on a toothbrush was too much for those in leadership in China. They really don't care about their population. And I also want to thank you for differentiating, Ashley, between the Chinese Communist Party and those party leaders and the people of China, because there is a difference there. There is a difference. So thank you for that. So my mission as I travel across the state of Iowa and all across the United States, and the work that I am doing with the Bastion Institute, is to really help Americans understand why it is so important that America remain engaged and remain a leader around the world. We cannot abdicate our authority, whether it is militarily, whether it is in trade or economics. We need to remain engaged. And I think this discussion today has been very helpful. So in the time that we have left, and Ashley, I'll start with you, maybe just explain from your perspective why it is important that America stay a leader in the world.
Well, first of all, I want to thank Joni Ernst, because she is a great voice for Iowa and our country around the world. She's been leading delegations to many of these places we've talked about, to Ukraine, to deal with the situation and the fallout from Afghanistan and many of the women who were impacted negatively by that. So we are very lucky to have Joni out there on that stage, helping make sure that America looks strong. I think it's absolutely critical that we are not perceived as weak going forward, and that is where I think our role in speaking out about these things and developing serious policies that are going to actually counter, the Chinese dream, which is that they are the superior economic world military power by 2049. They have been very, very clear about their goals and intentions. So we must also be very, very clear as leaders around the world and here in the Midwest about what we're doing to make sure that we are handling these things, not only for our people, but there are so many other people around the world who are watching what we're doing here. And so we are setting the bar. And I know we like to talk about Ronald Reagan, but Speaker McCarthy invited us out when President Tsai Ing-wen came to the United States for a visit from Taiwan. And we had a chance to go through the Reagan Library and Museum, and I was struck by, and I'll close with this, a quote from President Reagan, who was talking about communism and what it does to countries. And, he had the perspective that we would never, ever beat communism, but we would be able to rise above it. And I think that's exactly why strong leadership matters on the global stage.
Well, I'm always reminded of this moment a few years ago when China was yet again abrogating certain international agreements it had made and taking over Hong Kong. And Hong Kong was this sort of remarkable economic powerhouse. And there were these historic protests in the streets of Hong Kong, and thousands of people coming out into the streets to protest this communist takeover of their country. And if you look at the pictures from that day, one sort of curious thing stands out. It's that these people, many of them were holding American flags. Think about that. I mean, so I just bring that up to suggest that even, and this is a time of remarkable political division in America, all sorts of problems. If you read the American press, it's like America's the worst place ever, blah. But in foreign countries, even on our worst day, people are still looking to us for leadership. There's nowhere else to go, okay? We're still that shining city upon a hill, whether we like it or not. And we have to pass that same gift we've been given on to the next generation, because whether you were born here, whether you came here via the immigration system, regardless, if you are an American citizen, you hit the jackpot. In a world in which China is the dominant power is a very dark world. We do not want to live in that world. This is a world that we have built in cooperation with our allies. We need to keep it safe. We need to keep it free. And we need to do everything in our power to look ourselves in the mirror when we're done with public life and we're all hanging it up, to say we did everything possible to pass that gift of being an American citizen on to the next generation.
Thank you. Yes, thank you so much. And I will just close by saying thank you both so much for those words. And it is extremely important. And again, the reason for founding the Bastion Institute and doing these foreign policy discussions, discussions on trade, discussions on energy, is just to remind the American people that we have the power and might here in the United States. We shouldn't abdicate our authority in these areas to other countries around the world. We are looked to by so many other nations for leadership, and we need to provide that leadership. It doesn't mean that we're moving away from America first. America should always be first. But the point is, it is not America alone. And only by showing leadership around the world can we leverage our partners and our allies to make the world a more stable place where we all can thrive and prosper. And that is the beauty of the United States and our people. And we should never forget that we can bring all kinds of factions and nations together and provide a more peaceful world for our future generations. And so I want to thank you all so much for coming out for the discussion today, for listening intently to Congresswoman Ashley Hinson and Congressman Mike Gallagher. Can we please thank them for sharing their thoughts today? And again, Ashley, Mike, thank you. On behalf of the Bastion Institute, our board of directors, and from me as well, I want to thank you very much for spending a good hour with us today and talking about the issues that are really important, not just to Iowa and Wisconsin, but to our great United States of America as well. Thank you all very much for coming out today. Thank you.